podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
It's midway through the Australian Open. The quarterfinal lineups are set, and I am still alive, remarkably. This is Tennis Unfiltered.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
I'm James Gray of inews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. I've got our resident tennis coach Calvin Betton here to help me go through the Australian Open. George Bellshaw, our tennis writer, is on his way, albeit, I believe, running a little late. So we'll start without him, and he can bring us the benefit of his insights when he gets back. We're going to talk about Novak Djokovic. We'll talk a bit about Andrei Rublev as well. Holger Rune, they had not necessarily a high-quality match, but certainly a dramatic match in 5 sets in the fourth round, as did Tsitsipas and Sinner. We'll have a look at that. In the women's draw, we lost Iga Świątek and Coco Gauff, and they're the main lines in what is now an absolute bin fire of a draw. I don't think anyone will mind me saying. But we'll start with the men's because, well, that's the one I've written down first. It's also the one that's freshest in my memory, having watched Alex De Minaur and Novak Djokovic last night. 5 of the 8 matches in round 4 went to 5 sets. It feels like it's been a tournament of 5-setters, in fact, and late-night finishes, as anyone who has been following me on Twitter or listening to the podlets or reading what I've been writing will know. There's been a lot of late-night finishes, and not many of them have been appreciated. Actually, before we get going, Calvin, I was going to ask you, what's the latest you've ever played or coached tennis?
The latest I've coached would probably be finishing at about 10:30.
It's pretty good.
They used to, yeah. I mean, that's mainly because tennis centres don't open until like much later. But that is always one, like, people always find it weird because I do sleep late. I do go to sleep late, and I do eat late, and I think all tennis coaches do, because generally we work until, when you work in a club, you're going to work until 9, 10 o'clock at night, and by the time you get home, it's 10:30, 11 o'clock. The latest I've played, there used to be a big tournament that went off at Huddersfield, like a sort of national level tournament that went off at Huddersfield, a big one, and they would play up until... I've probably played up until 2 in the morning at some stage, because the matches would start late on at night, and they used to get, it's a really good tournament actually, where, and I've seen other tournaments like this, the Sutton British Tour has been similar, where like they'll they make it a night of it, so they'll have a bar night and food in the bar, so the matches will only start at say 6 o'clock, and then there'll be 3 or 4 rounds of matches, and you can easily go on until 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. I was actually thinking though about the Murray one today, the Murray with Kokkinakis, and I thought to myself that, like, that sort of the tangent of the match, how it went, in that once it got to sort of 12 o'clock, 11, 12 o'clock, and we know Tennessee Kokkinakis, he enjoys himself outside of tennis. He sort of, like, you know, he does like a club and a bar. I know that, and there's nothing wrong with that. He's a young lad who likes to go out, and I thought then, you know, it's probably like thinking about Murray, or, you know, you've not been up this late in some time. Like, this is my wheelhouse. This I could drag you into the sort of 1:30 to 2:30 time zones. But then when it gets to 4 o'clock, Andy Murray has about 4 or 5 kids, and he does know the hours of 4 and 5 o'clock. And then I wondered whether Murray starts thinking, "You're in my house now." and was that the problem, that Kokkinakis didn't finish him in his window of opportunity before it got to 4 o'clock? Like,
this ain't late anymore, sweetheart. This is early.
Yeah. Then Kokkinakis is then flagging, as most lads who are 20, 23, 24, 25 do at 4 o'clock in the morning. But if you've got 4 or 5 kids, 4 o'clock's the start of the day.
It's child's play, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can confirm that it felt both late and early. And what people who listen to the Podler and maybe the last pod will know is that when you're a journalist, when the tennis stops, in some ways that's when your job starts, because then you start writing, and then you've got to do the press conference, and then you've got to write that, and blah, blah, blah. And then you've got to do a podcast quite often after that. So, yeah, a late one. We're going to talk about alternative scheduling ideas for the tournament because I put something on Twitter saying what your burning questions, and Rugby Post has been in touch and said, talk about alternative scheduling ideas for the tournament, please. We will, but George Bellshaw is the scheduling expert, so I think it's worth waiting for him to come through with something to solve all of our problems. I tell you what, we also haven't talked about, Calvin, which we should, is Henry and Julian, who made it through one round, as I think we talked about on the last pod, but then were beaten by the Dutch pair. I mean, I guess they're still quite new at this level to an extent, i.e. Grand Slam level. So, I mean, I know they'll be disappointed anyway because pros always are.
Yeah, it was disappointing. I actually just tonight I rewatched the match for the first time, and it was just close. You know, it was a high quality doubles match, high quality serving. There weren't many rallies, and as with most doubles matches, it's on a knife edge, and you know the other lads played a little bit better, got a little bit more rub of the green, and I think if they played that match 100 times, they'd win 49 of them. What I would say, but yeah, you know, it moves on, and we move to the next tournament, which for them will be Dallas ATP.
So, where are their next kind of moves? What does the next couple of weeks look like for them? Have they got jet setting to do, or are they coming home?
So Henry has gone straight to America because his girlfriend lives in America. So he's having a week with her, and then he'll go to Dallas from there. Julian has come home because his girlfriend lives in England. Who both must have the patience of saints because they've barely seen their boyfriends for the last 6 months. So they've been kind enough to grant them 1 week each, and then they'll meet up in Dallas in I think 2 weeks' time. So there's a 250 in Dallas and then a 250 in Delray Beach, which they'll play. And then after that, it really depends how they do in those. It's then whether we're looking at Miami and Indian Wells, or whether they'd probably have to get to a combined ranking of 80, so 40 each, to get in those. Or if they don't get to that, then we're probably looking at some sort of training block, I would think, over that period. But I would imagine it's going to be Dallas, Delray, and then possibly Acapulco, and then it'll depend how they do in those.
Just on that, like having a week off away from each other as doubles players, like how much of it is a week off? Like, because it's in the middle of the season in some ways, as you say, there's still tournaments to go. Like, presumably they'll both be in the gym still. Will they both be hitting still with someone they can find?
I would think they'll probably have 3 or 4 days off, because they've not really had that at all. I think they've had a week off in the last sort of 9 months, and then the travelling obviously puts a stop on that, because I know that Henry flew straight to America, so he had a 14-hour flight to LA, and then I think a 4-hour layover, and then a flight to Denver, and Jules, I think maybe is looking at a 36-hour flight home, so you've got jet lag and everything. So I would think they'll probably have maybe 4 or 5 days off, and then they'll probably have maybe 10 days of hitting before the next tournament.
Well, good luck to them, and as I always say, it's nice to have a dog in the fight in some ways. Right, let's move on to the singles main draw, because I promised that we would. As I say, 5 of the 8 matches going to 5 sets in the 4th round. We've got the quarterfinal lineup set now. It's Khachanov versus Korda, Tsitsipas versus Lehechka, Rublev versus Djokovic, and Ben Shelton against Tommy Paul in the all-unseeded, all-American bottom quarter final. But I suppose that really the only place to start is Novak Djokovic once again, because he is the centre of attention. His left hamstring remains the centre of attention. He absolutely marmalised Alex De Minaur last night. There's no other word for it, I've decided. 6-2, 6-1, 6-2. I don't really remember Novak Djokovic hitting the ball so hard. Quite apart from striking it well and being unbeatable, he hit it so hard. Alex De Minaur did not have a single baseline-to-baseline winner. His 9 winners came from aces, overheads, and passing shots. When Novak Djokovic was stood on the baseline, he did not hit a winner, which is a pretty remarkable stat for any fourth round of a Grand Slam. Calvin, I know you're pretty unconvinced by the so-called injury, and I have to say, after that performance, I find it hard to disagree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally unconvinced. I'm not pretty unconvinced. And I was amazed that even after he won today, I saw some quotes from Djokovic where he was talking about this blooming hamstring again. Like, he just won like 6-2, 6-1, 6-2, and like put in the performance of the season so far, I say, from any player. And he's talking about, well, maybe I don't know whether my hamstring holds up. That's just not how it works. Like, if it was fine today, it's fine. And if it wasn't fine, he wouldn't have won by that score.
He was more optimistic, I would say, on it than he has been before. I mean, optimism is all sliding scale, but he did say that he recognised it was better today, and he sort of recognised the scoreline and said, well, I can't exactly stand here. He said it's a courier on court. He said, I can't really stand here and say my hamstring's hurting because I've just absolutely binned the guy. I mean, there's no love lost between Djokovic and De Minaur, by the way. They don't get on, and De Minaur said some pretty plain things about him. And it's funny because I was in De Minaur's press conference afterwards, and he was asked, do you think the guy's injured? And he just sort of laughed and went, well, I've just lost 2-1 and 2. Like, if he's injured, what does that say about me?
Yeah. I saw those quotes, yeah.
I'm not a good enough tennis player to expose that, or I don't know, it looked good to me. He was just too good in all aspects. I actually thought it was a bit of an unfair question to say to the guy, do you think he's injured? Well, I won 5 games, I didn't hit a winner.
I think it was asked, though, because everybody knows the score, don't they? And I think everybody just finds it bizarre. Everybody finds it weird. And like I said on the pod last week, if his hamstring was hurting 2 days ago, which he had the trainer on, he was like, we were back to this sort of, he lost a set and we're back to this sort of, is he going to be able to play on? He's got the trainer on, right? Your hamstring does not heal that quick. Even if he had a slight pull in the hamstring, it's the slowest healing muscle in the human body. It wouldn't have healed in this time. So I can only assume that he's not injured at all. And either he thinks he is, there's something psychologically in his head, which might be the case. Some people have that. Or for some reason, he feels he's got to say these types of things.
Well, Calvin, he's got an answer for you, because one of the Serbian journalists asked him whether he was faking it, basically. Or I suspect he wasn't phrased like that because I know how those press conferences go. But he says, I leave the doubting to those people. Let them doubt. Only my injuries are questioned. When some other players are injured, then they are the victims. But when it is me, I'm faking it. It's very interesting. I don't feel I need to prove anything to anyone. I'm not really interested at this point in what people are thinking and saying, which, by the way, is objectively a lie because he's currently talking about what people are thinking and saying. It's fun. It's interesting to see how the narrative surrounding me continues. Narrative that is different compared to other players that have been going through a similar situation, but I'm used to it. It just gives me extra strength and motivation, so I thank them for that. Novak Djokovic playing the siege mentality card, which has been used so effectively by coaches over the years.
Which of the players claim to have extremely serious injuries? Not extremely serious, but serious injuries.
Well, the obvious comparison is Nadal, right?
But Nadal is evidently struggling, and he doesn't win the tournaments, and he pulls out. Nadal does withdraw from tournaments regularly.
So the example that was put to me on Twitter, inevitably, by someone with a crocodile in their handle, was the French Open this year, when obviously Nadal said before, look, I've got this injury and I've got this doctor with me and I'm dealing with it. And then obviously afterwards had surgery. I guess the difference is, I don't remember Nadal having a medical timeout for his foot injury at Roland Garros. Like, he was just, he was like, I've got this thing, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Let's talk about it after the tournament.
And it's a pain, and he's got a pain. He's got a foot condition, right? That, as I said last week on the pod, it's the nature of the injury. It's this hamstring injury. You cannot play. And I've spoken to 2 or 3 more players in the last couple of days. We were discussing it. Every single person has said you cannot play with an injured hamstring. Your leg would not work. So anybody with crocodiles in their in their Twitter bios or anything like that. They need to get a grip, because your leg would not work if you have a tear or a pull in your hamstring. If your hamstring is tight, then yeah, you can feel it, but that's not an injury. That doesn't stop you doing anything. So and strapping it up wouldn't prevent your hamstring from being tight.
George Bellshaw has joined us, fresh from the five-a-side pitch. George, I have written down a question for you, and you've arrived at the perfect moment. Is it possible that Novak Djokovic has decided that everyone talking about his injury all week is like one of those marginal gains, and that this is actually just another piece of Machiavellian shithousery, or is he just being overly dramatic?
I mean, it's so hard to kind of get in the mindset of why this guy would want to be running around faking an injury, other than, to really wind people up. I mean, I say faking in a kind of
hyperbolic way.
Hyperbolic way. I mean, the person I was thinking about this week, because I agree with Calvin, like, hamstring injuries are not one that you can really muck around with. We had all these conversations about an ab problem before and how severe that was, but a hamstring is something that, if you've had a hamstring injury, you can't do anything. The one person I could think of who's kind of had a hamstring injury in professional sport recently that I was thinking about was Mikhail Antonio. And even then, he just kept coming off at like 55 minutes. Djokovic is playing like 3 hours of sport every time, and a lot of kind of stop, start, left, right. It just feels so weird. And, a tight hamstring, does he really need that much treatment? Does he need to make this much of a deal of it? But the other side, from the kind of mental thing, I do get a bit of a feeling with Djokovic that there's this kind of stemmed feeling of, people don't respect my wins as much, and sometimes is there just a bit of a mental thing where he kind of wants to feel like the world's against him, wants to feel like every injury is so bad that even if it's kind of a lighter thing than he's making out, but he wants to kind of prove he's this superhuman, brilliant, I can get through anything because I'm Novak Djokovic. I don't know, it's all so odd. And De Minaur, as I'm sure you guys have already covered, apologies for being late, he didn't believe him. He said as much in his post-match interview, and it's hard to believe him, to be honest. He makes it hard because you watch him yesterday, you're like, bloody hell, there's nothing wrong with this bloke. He's pamping someone who's been a top 20 player. It can't be that bad.
I think in terms of, to answer the question, is what would be the point in it? Why does he do it? You're seeing it in front of our bare eyes. The people on social media with crocodiles in their AVIs, they're banging on about how it's an amazing achievement. He's winning despite this hamstring injury, and he seems to just thrive on that because he tested it. He gave it a test run 2 years ago, didn't he? With the ab injury, and it's like he got so much over the top praise for that from his fans. That look, it's amazing. How many times has Roger Federer won a Grand Slam with a 3-inch tear in his ab? Well, Novak's done it now, and that's why he does it. I'm certain that's why he does it.
He did mention that incidentally in his Serbian quotes, where he said, maybe I'll release the MRI, maybe I won't, regarding his abdominal tear.
I wonder which it'll be. It's a real head scratcher.
The other thing I would say about his kind of medical history, and this will be something interesting to kind of watch over the years, is like there are times where he has in the past had like an injury he's been talking about, and if the match is going badly, and I'm thinking Burdick at Wimbledon a long time ago with a shoulder, where he was kind of making a point about the scheduling after he had to play a day later because they wouldn't move him from court 1 to centre or something when the rain had been hitting. The other one that sticks out was Wawrinka, US Open. I can't remember the year, but he had a shoulder problem, kind of fourth round, didn't seem to fancy it when he went 2 sets down. He is a bit kind of, I think he does make calls within the match when he's like, he might have a slight problem. If the match is going against him, he kind of might sack it off. So that'll be interesting if he gets put into a position. Against De Minaur, he was just too good, no problem. But if he found himself 2 sets down against someone, I have seen him just be like, actually, screw this, can't be bothered. And then he'll be back 2 weeks later, still pumping everyone again.
It's hard to believe that situation is coming imminently. I think Andre
Yeah.
Rula probably going to get chopped in a similar way, but I could be wrong, Calvin.
I think it's interesting that you look at the players that are left and the players who he's playing, like they don't really have the capital that they can challenge this. I think if this had have come in peak top big four type thing, I don't know whether he'd be trying this versus, for example, Andy Murray, and whether Murray would stand for this. Whereas the other guys don't. I just don't know if they have the political capital to be challenging on that.
And of course, early in his career, you did get Federer kind of calling him out for a lot of his kind of behaviour in terms of injuries and retirements and kind of timeouts he was taking. So, Calvin's right. There was a bit more. When people like Federer speak, it becomes a bigger, more kind of fraught issue. Whereas it's even the De Minaur quote said, okay, he has cast doubt on it, but it's someone that most people probably in the broader sporting casual sense don't know who this is, and it's not that big a significant thing. And you probably look at Djokovic beating the world number, whatever De Minaur is at the minute, 25 in straight sets, so you don't really bat an eyelid because he's that good. So Calvin's right. It's kind of harder to make a big storm of it, and I just don't know who's going to beat him at the minute, to be honest, particularly in that bottom half. It's just hard to see him not getting to the final, even if he is on one leg as he claims to be.
Yeah, it would be a remarkable achievement if he really is on one leg to get to a Grand Slam final. He has so many Grand Slam finals now that he scarcely remembers some of them. Calvin tweeted an extremely funny quote, which I missed from the press conference last night, actually, where he said, being the only guy remaining in the tournament that has won a Grand Slam, of course, flatters me, but I don't think it's going to make too much of a big difference. I don't know. I know Tsitsipas, for example, probably the most experienced guy out of all of them. He's played the final stages of a Grand Slam quite a few times. I think he has never played a final. Am I wrong? And one of the journalists points out, you beat him in Roland Garros. It was a good match. You came back from 2 sets down. And he said, that's right. Sorry, my bad. Imagine having, in the words of Calvin Betton, the great thinker, imagine playing in and winning so many major finals that you forget who you've played and beaten in some of them. Stefanos Tsitsipas does have a very good chance of making that 2 major finals after he came through a 5-setter with Jannik Sinner. He plays the Czech surprise package Jiří Hečka in the next round. He did have a 2-set lead on Jannik Sinner, which he then sacrificed to give us yet another 5-setter and yet another late night. It was one of those 5-setters to an extent where one guy plays well for 2 sets and the other guy plays well for 2 sets, but I think there were some pretty competitive moments. Calvin, as someone who's criticised Stefanos Tsitsipas's backhand one way or another over the years, it's interesting that it held up so well in the kind of cross-court exchanges against Jannik Sinner, who's got one of the better two-handers around.
I only saw the last 3 sets, and I'm not sure it did hold up well. I know a few people had said that, and he hit some flashy shots. I'm not sure it did hold up particularly well. I think what he did do is he served very well, and managed to cover it up. But in the rallies, I think that he was never better than 50-50 backhand to backhand with Sinner. And I think what he did well in particular was he managed to stop Sinner getting his forehand into Tsitsipas's backhand, and also Sinner's not one of the great volleyers, whereas I think a better player would have drilled his backhand. If a better volleyer had Sinner's forehand, they'd have drilled Tsitsipas's backhand and got into the net, and it's just not his game. Although I was impressed with Sinner, to be fair. I thought he'd really added a lot of variation and different type of stuff to his game, which is something I've been critical of him previously. I still have doubts whether this is not the best we see of Sinner, because he's still in the big tournaments. He doesn't beat the seeded guys above him regularly enough.
It's interesting you say he has added variety. He's got Darren Cahill in his corner now, who's obviously regarded as one of the best coaches in the world. And it's the first time I've seen a coach really actively using the hand signal rule. So people may not know that coaching is obviously allowed at the Australian Open this year. It's on trial at all the Grand Slams this year. If the player's at the other end, you're not allowed to say anything, but you can use hand signals. And Cahill was pretty just holding up 2 fingers, as if to say plan number 2 or whatever that particularly meant, which I thought was very interesting.
He was definitely telling him to drill the backhand. They went to him on a few times, and he was 100% saying keep focusing on his backhand. I'd be interested to see. Actually, I know that I don't know whether any of the listeners follow on Twitter, but there's a great account that covers things like this called Tennis Insights, and I'd be interested to see that they sort of measure the effectiveness of players' forehands and backhands, and I'd be interested to see if they've done one on Tsitsipas's backhand, say compared to Sinner's backhand during that match, and what was more effective. But I would be surprised if he isn't below average on their metric, which is pretty accurate in terms of backhand effectiveness.
George?
Backhand aside, or what words? I mean, that was a big result for Tsitsipas. I mean, he's really struggled since that French Open final at Majors. He's looked a bit of a shell of himself, and I've felt kind of lost a lot of confidence. So, he's in a really good position now to reach the final. I would be putting money on either him or Korda from this stage, as well as Lehecka has done. I think Khachanov would probably be the one I'd be most surprised about in some ways, even though Lehecka's quite a surprise package. But
we're going Lehecka, by the way, George.
Lehecka, apologies. Very good, very good. Sorry, apologies. I knew I was pronouncing it wrong, though I could see there's something funny going on with that C, but given my poor Anglophobic nature, I didn't make any effort, which is
I mean, you're not Anglophobic, George. You're quite the opposite.
I'm not Anglophobic. I'm the opposite of that.
You're xenophobic. I mean, you're losing it as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Sorry,
you were saying.
No, I was just saying mentally, I think that was a big result for him. I had Sinner down to win that before the match, and although he got himself in a tight position, losing that kind of 2 sets lead, he did well to kind of steady himself and get through. So, yeah, I think that was a potentially positive moment to get back on track at the majors when it was feeling like his career was starting to stall a little bit.
Calvin, you had something to say.
Sorry, yeah. I think what I was going to say was on that, actually, the guys, what I was just referring to, Tennis Insights, have actually done a really interesting one on the Korda Khachanov match, and they've got Korda ahead on every single metric, which would suggest, and they've said that they've played a couple of times before, I think, and Korda's won both, or they played 3 times, but once Korda was pretty young. Last year they played twice, and every single thing on their metric, Korda is just better. I found it really interesting that, because you'd think that, for example, backhand to backhand, which is Khachanov's better shot, it's not better than his forehand, as I'm criticising myself there.
Relative terms.
Yeah, it's a good backhand. He does have a good backhand, but even Korda is beating him on backhand to backhand.
That's interesting. I mean, I was looking at Korda's winner stats the other day, and I think he's got fewer than 20 backhand winners in the entire tournament so far, and he's played quite a lot of tennis. So that does tell you something about what's going on there. But maybe he has a more solid shot than I had anticipated. Calvin, I've got a technical question for you, because Tsitsipas said something on court afterwards that was quite technical. And he admitted as much. He said, some of you won't understand this. And sure enough, I didn't. He said, I think that he was being asked about what got better in the 5th set after he lost 2 sets in a row. He said, I think I just released my arm a little bit, released my wrist on the serve. That helped me a lot to generate more power and accuracy, something I wasn't doing before. It completely changed the way I approached this match. Does that sound like something a player can do mid-match?
Yeah, it's the something I always tell my players to do. It's just relaxation. You'll always get more power with more muscle relaxation. If your muscles are tense and tight, and you end up trying to force things and push things and muscle them, whereas natural power comes from relaxation.
And I'm sure he had Mark Philippoussis in the box, who I spoke to the other day, and I said, how much do you actually say in the box? And the unspoken question was, because Apostolos talks a lot. And Mark is suitably diplomatic, actually, sometimes, and he didn't say a lot.
I'd seen today, actually, related to Tsitsipas, I'd seen there's in Dubai, there is a junior ITF going on. And I saw I looked at the draw, as I tend to do, look at these things, and I saw that on there is probably the words, being that I've worked in Futures and Challengers tennis, the words that I have seen as more than any other words over the last 3 or 4 years.
I already know what this is.
Tsitsipas wildcard. And the number of times I have seen P. Tsitsipas WC on a draw sheet. And it's, of course, it's the other one. We're not talking about Petros anymore.
Oh, this isn't Petros anymore. It's Pavlos.
No, it's Pavlos. Yes, yeah.
Oh, of course, because it's a junior event. Yeah, I did see that, and I was like, Tsitsipas wildcard, very funny. But I didn't, because it's a junior event, not a futures event. Okay, fun. I assume that came to your attention because Marcus Buckland's son is playing in it.
Yeah, that must have been his tweet that I saw. Yeah.
Yeah.
Having said that, we give Petros a little bit of stick. Him and Stefanos actually took Neil Skupski and Wesley Koolhof really close in the doubles. I think it was 7-6 in the third, maybe, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was a 10-7 match tie rate. Yeah. Very close indeed. 2 hours and 3/4, I think. So. Yes, not the worst doubles pair in the world. Anyway, let's move on. I don't know whether we want to talk about Ben Shelton or Andrei Rublev. Let's start with Andrei Rublev because we've just talked about a great match tiebreak in the doubles. This was a great match tiebreak in the singles, albeit perhaps not for quality. I would argue this is another match where no one played very well at the same time. Classic 5-set match that. But Holger Rune served for the match at 5-3 and was broken to love. He had match points at 4-5 and again went a bit passive and missed them. And he was 5-love up in the match tiebreak and then lost it 11-9. George, Holger Rune is a good player, clearly. And I said to him afterwards that he, the fact that he was really, really disappointed. And I said to him the fact that he was against a guy who is, let's face it, the second highest seed left in the draw, probably shows how high a level he's playing. But he has very high expectations of himself, doesn't he?
Yeah, and to be honest, I had him down to win that one as well. I thought he'd been playing some good stuff, but I think Rublev, as we've said before, is probably quite close to his ceiling, whereas Rune, it feels, is on the up. And I think Rune, this may come back to bite me when Djokovic's hamstring snaps or something, but I think Rune would have been the bigger test for him, to be honest. I think there's less scarring there. I'd be quite surprised if Rublev really was the guy to finish Novak off. So, yeah, disappointing for him. But again, he's a very young guy and he's had a big burst through last year. You can't knock a solid fourth round first slam of the year for him, and he feels like he's going to get better. And, we mocked him over the years for his comments about Nadal and the clay, but he does feel pretty comfortable there. So it'll be really interesting to see where he's at this year coming into that season, particularly, given Nadal's struggles and not, teams not there. Novak hasn't quite hit the heights on the clay the last year. So that'll be interesting to see how he comes into that swing, I think.
I should also point out that this match went down to, as I say, match tiebreak, Rune serving at 9-10, and Rublev smacks a backhand return into the tape, and it lands dead on Rune's side.
A few of those, haven't there? Was it Murray Berrettini as well?
Murray Berrettini was that, and there was a Tommy Paul match. I think it was against. I think the Batista Agut match yesterday also was a chord. What's it called? A
horrible way to end.
Yeah, I mean, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because Murray had just won a 5-setter against Berrettini, and he sort of had to put his hands up and say sorry, and then couldn't really celebrate. It's a very kind of awkward situation. I think it was Berrettini. It wasn't Kokkinakis, was it?
I think so.
Yeah.
Berrettini.
Yeah,
I don't think Jensen Brooksby would have been too fussed by not celebrating them.
Well, he actually did have one at a really crucial moment against Casper Ruud and didn't fist pump it, and I was like, oh mate, stick to what you know. If you're going to fist pump net cords at 2-3 in the first set, you should be doing it at big moments, otherwise you're breaking your routine. But anyway, that's Jensen Brooksby's no longer in the tournament, so because he got absolutely pummeled by Tommy Paul, 1-4-3, which I thought was a really odd result. I mean, Tommy Paul's a good player, and maybe we should talk about Tommy Paul because he is next up against Ben Shelton. For people who don't know Ben Shelton, he's the NCAA champion. He's a lefty. He has hit the fastest serve of the tournament so far. He's the first NCAA champion to reach the quarterfinals of the following Australian Open since Arthur Ashe in 1966. He had never been out of the United States until he flew to Australia for the United Cup. I mean, hell of a story, Calvin. You know the college system well. I guess is it turning into the kind of place where it produces these guys ready to go in the pro game straight out?
I think in Ben's case, it's a bit skewed because he was ready to move out of college tennis 12 months ago. And were it not that his dad was the head coach of University of Florida, and they really wanted to win the tournament, I think that, and his dad probably wanted him to get the kudos for the university of winning the NCAAs. I don't think Ben would have still been in college a year ago.
Right.
So I think he was comfortably by a mile the best player in college tennis last year. So yeah, I think it's a bit skewed to say the first player that's won it and made the quarterfinal, because there would have been a lot of guys who, had they stayed, would have made the final and then made quarterfinals, if you know what I mean.
I see. And Tommy Paul as a matchup, George. I mean, look, watching Ben Shelton on court after he beat JJ Wolf in the All-American fourth round, like, incredible energy. He was so pumped. But if he was going to hand pick a quarterfinal opponent, I'm not saying Tommy Paul's a bad player, but he's unseeded. Like, it's a hell of an opportunity for him, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great chance. I've been really, really impressed by Shelton this tournament. I was watching him from a bit of a fancy perspective more than anything in the third round against my boy Popyrin, who and he just absolutely demolished him. I mean, I think I was joking on WhatsApp that Popyrin's not much more than a serve, to be fair. So, but he had more variety than I was expecting from Shelton. He hits the ball so clean, though. The power, it's really, really great clean hitting. Tommy Paul's had some good results over the last couple of years. He's really kind of matured as a solid tour player, and there's always a bit of bite when it's two compatriots as well. Particularly Americans. There's a lot of that'll be a big match for those two, a chance to kind of prove their way through. And tennis has lacked good American players really for a long time, and we've talked about TFO a lot. But Korda's a high quality player. Sheldon feels like he's got a really high ceiling as well. It would be good for the sport in terms of getting it back up into that US market, the focal point a little bit more. If some of these guys can push on and have good rivalries, and Tommy Paul, why not be part of that as well?
I would also put Brandon Nakashima in that bracket. I've been really impressed with everything I've seen him do and the way he goes about his business. There are now 10 American men in the top 50 in the world. 20% of the top 50 in the world are American men, which, I mean, I was talking to Bob Bryan about it, actually, funnily enough, the other day, and kind of saying, this is pretty big for the game, isn't it? And he said, well, yeah, like, America expects greatness, and so hopefully one of these guys can go and win a slam in 12 months. And that maybe is the point. Like, if none of these guys win a slam, and you could say soon, then it might actually not mean that much, because if you want to, penetrate an American sport, you've got to win.
Yeah. Korda, I'm feeling, has turned a real corner this year, and he feels kind of ready to me. I think he'll push Tsitsipas really close in the semis. I'm not saying he'll definitely win, but he's played some really, really good stuff and looked really impressive, and he's got a pretty complete game. Suspect this will be a tournament too soon for Shelton, but he'll be there and thereabouts, I'm sure, as well. He's going to be. I'd be surprised if he wasn't a top 10, top 5 player. And I think this next era there will be chances to win slams.
If anybody, when we were just talking a couple of minutes ago about being loose and muscle relaxation, if anyone wants to see an example of that, then watch Ben Shelton, because he has one of the loosest arms I've ever seen. He's up there with Kyrgios in that regard. Somebody did say, though, that cracked me up a little bit. I think Ben Shelton is brilliant, by the way. I saw somebody earlier comparing with John McEnroe. They said it reminded them of John McEnroe, and I can't, other than they're left-handed, I can't think of two players who play anything less like each other. I don't know how anybody's managed to come to that conclusion.
Right, coming up next, we'll dip into the mailbag, and we'll also look at the women's draw.
Sports Social, now on the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello, I'm Brian McClare. I used to kick a football around for Celtic and Manchester United. McClare! These days, I'm joined by special guests to talk anything and everything on my podcast, Life with Brian.
When you meet footballers, you just giddy, aren't you? You kind of like, they've lived your dreams.
Me and Bez, we're inseparable a lot of the time.
So join me and listen to Life with Brian, the Brian McClare podcast, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Tennis Unfiltered with me, James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper, live and exclusive from Melbourne. I've got George Bellshaw, the tennis writer, and our resident tennis coach, Calvin Betton, alongside me. Calvin, I'm going to dip into the mailbag for the beginning of part 2 because I've got some big questions and some small questions. I would characterise this as somewhere in between. It's come via Twitter. You can follow us on Twitter, Unfiltered Tennis, and it's come from a listener called Get, and he says, been watching tennis for a while now, almost daily, and of course 250s and challengers whenever they're on, but there one thing as an athlete of other sports I've always wondered and been confused by is why so many professionals will hit so many overhead dry volleys. You see them miss so often. I understand get it back quicker and the other player is out of position, but when it's a high lob they tend to hit a lot and miss wildly. Why not position and hit it off the bounce with more power and accuracy? Just doesn't seem like a good gamble to me. Calvin, state your case.
It's for the very best players. It's not a gamble, and I think it's one of those that you can remember the misses. It's sort of a cognitive bias like that. But the good players, they will put away 19 out of 20 smashes. They're just always you remember the misses because they look so easy. But the only reason why you would let it bounce is if it's close to the net and you can bounce it high and hard over. But other than that, it's just not worth the extra time that, if you're competent on the overhead, it's not worth the extra time that you're giving your opponent to get back into position by letting it bounce.
I had a question about this question that I was wondering if Calvin could also answer for me. Is there such thing as a drive volley? I thought a drive volley was the one where you kind of swing through it at full pace, at kind of like a proper swing in the air. But what's a drive volley? Does he just mean a snap?
I suspect this
That's
is a mistranslation. I suspect this is someone
never
who's heard the phrase drive volley and heard it as drive.
So is he referring to drive volleys rather than
but he said overhead drive volley, which we would call a smash. I think
the one thing something I always found strange, and I know Louis Caillet mentioned this to me. I'd never really thought about this. He mentioned this to me years ago. Was that why in the women's tour? Why at the start of when they're warming up? Why do they warm up sort of 9 or 7 or 8, 9 or 10 overheads? When it comes to the match, they always drive volley them. They don't hit the actual smash. Surely they'd be better off warming up drive volleys rather than overhead.
I still have mental scars from watching Konta in the French Open final. I think it was. In fact, I think it was the semi-finals a couple of years later. She missed some shocking. No, it was the semi-finals against Vondrousova. Sorry, some shocking drive volleys in key moments where it was just easier just to step in and either volley it or take it earlier on the rise as a smash. I mean, it drove me insane how kind of mental it was taking those kind of high risk drive volleys and just sending them at the back of the court.
Again, I feel like I'm kind of like the Ben Shelton appreciation pod here, but if anyone wants to see an overhead, watch Ben Shelton's overhead, because as I said last week on the pod, it might be the best overhead I've ever seen. He does not miss them, and he hits them hard.
I look forward to Ben Shelton having the worst overhead day of his life against Tommy Paul now.
A little technical one on the overhead, actually, that when you ask players, and I always ask players this when they come to me and they don't have good overheads, is you ask what is more important in an overhead, power or placement, and they usually say placement, and it's not. It's power. If you hit an overhead hard and in the court, it rarely comes back, and if it comes back with an even easier overhead. So the area why players usually miss them is that they try and go too deep with them and they try and place them. And the target for an overhead should always be on the service line. If you hit the service line hard, it will rarely ever come back. And if it does, at worst case, you're getting another one of the same shot and you hit the same shot again and it won't come back the second time.
That's your top tip if you're playing this weekend.
If you see anybody miss one long, that's just poor decision-making and poor smashing.
George, you had something to say? George,
I was just going to say, if Calvin's claiming Ben Shelton's got the best overhead in the world and he ends up playing Novak, who's got one of the worst ones in the world, maybe it'll just be a tactic to just keep it in the air all game.
And what a match that would be to watch. Right, I've got a couple of other mail bags. George, this one is definitely for you. It's from Rugby Posts on Twitter. Talk about alternative scheduling ideas for the tournament, please. I know how much you love scheduling.
Yeah. Are we talking in the context of kind of bringing women's on the kind of best of 5, or are we talking kind of FA
whatever
Cup
you want,
style
mate.
draws?
Like honestly, if it means that I get out of there before 5 a.m., then I'm pro.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think a general rule across tennis should be absolute maximum one night session if you're going to insist on a night session. I think
Do you mean one match in the night
one
session?
match per night session, yeah. I think night sessions are terrible and just another way to rip off fans. I think if you're buying a ticket, you should be able to go into anything. I hate the changeovers where they're taking one set of fans out and bringing them in. So I would personally ban them. I think there's just got to be more fluidity in terms of the matches. People quite often are suggesting these days best of 3 sets for men in the first 4th round and best of 3 for the women, and then take them both to best of 5. That's another option. I'm growing more popular with that, but then I see matches like Murray against Berrettini, and you do get some absolute belter kind of 5 sets in the early rounds when you least expect it. But maybe that's just being a British fan of Murray at this stage of his career, that you're not going to get any late 5-set classics with him, so we've got to kind of cherish the early round ones whilst we can. But yeah, FA Cup style draws, my other one. It's not so much a scheduling thing, but just one slam's got to do that. I really want that.
Yeah. I think for me, the best solution, and we've talked about this a lot, as you can imagine, over the last 2 weeks in the press box. I think the day sessions at the moment are 3 matches. I think they should be 2. And I think if you made sure that the women were always first on in the night session, that would also make sure that no one's starting a match at midnight. Because the problem is, if you're second on in the night session, the first match is a men's match, you actually don't know whether it's going to be 2 hours long or 5 hours long. Whereas with a women's match, that window is a bit smaller, so there's a smaller margin for error. I would also start the night session a bit earlier, maybe closer to 6 o'clock rather than 7 o'clock. All of these little marginal changes, because when it's gone really late in this past fortnight, it's been when they've started the night session late because, as you say, George, they've had to turn fans around because the middle session has gone long. And it's been when you've had men going pushing women really late. George?
This is going to be very controversial. I'm making this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but if you really want to solve scheduling problems in tennis, I mean this beyond the Grand Slams as well, then the person who has actually come closest to hitting the nail on the head was actually Patrick Mouratoglou, in terms of actually having timed sets of matches, completely throwing out the scoring system.
Honestly, I literally said it the other day. I turned to someone and said, I think Patrick might be right, and that pains me to say it. But yeah, the idea of saying, 2 hours and whoever scores the most points, I don't hate it. I appreciate that tennis has this unique scoring system, and Calvin, I feel like you might defend it more kind of eloquently than I ever could, but it is about winning more points most of the time.
I'm not opposed to different scoring systems in different tournaments, but the slams have to stay the same. They're the biggest test. These are the ones that we get the epics on. The epics, the great matches, are always the best of 5 sets. And you can list on one hand the epic best of 3s that we've watched over time. They're enjoyable at the time, but the matches that you remember, they're always because they're best of 5. And I just don't think we can. I don't really see how you can change that. I don't like the idea of both men's and women's playing best of 3 at the start and men's and women's playing best of 5 at the end. The eternal problem is, and I've been trying to word this, think a way of wording it, and I'm not on one side or the other. The eternal problem is what you're getting at the French Open, is that with the night session, the Aussie and the US, they try and do one men's, one women's, which means that if you have even if you have one competitive match there, you're probably finishing too late.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
you can't. So you can't have. So you're gonna finish late. So then the alternative is like the French do, where you only have one match, on the night session. But then they get criticised because they didn't have the women's matches on. But the women's matches, they're only best of 3 anyway, and they're just too often not competitive. And
they're just guaranteed to be shorter. Yeah, I mean that's the more salient point. I think. I think a women's match and a doubles match is fine. I think if you make the ticket prices better, then you have less of people being like, this is unreasonable. Also, make the balls faster.
Ban them is all you need to say about the night sessions. They're rubbish. They offer nothing apart from to the pockets of the tournament organisers are already making enough. They should not exist.
You would just have a day session that has 4 matches on it and like a not before on the 4th one.
Yeah.
Like
maybe not even a not before.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's greed, pure and simple. There is no positive thing that comes out of these night sessions apart from the tournament's pockets. That is it.
And that's Tennis Unfiltered from George Bellshaw. Let's move on because everyone's getting a bit angry. Elena Tsurdi has been in touch again. As always, she's got more than one question. We'll start with the first one. Best strategic plan for the brilliant Andy Murray to make the best of the upcoming season? Game adjustment, scheduling to clay or to not clay? Calvin, maybe you want to start with this one. Murray's plan is a couple of weeks off and then Rotterdam, followed by Dubai, Indian Wells, Miami, and then a decision to be made on the clay. Do you think it's worth him playing the clay in order? The idea last year was competitive matches before the grass season.
I mean, he keeps saying that his body is holding up fine and there's no issues in that regard. And if that's the case, then I'd definitely do the clay. If he wants to start getting seeded in the slams, he's got to play as many tournaments as he can. He can't be he's not going to get seeded at Wimbledon or the US Open unless he has a great run before then, or unless he plays the clay.
George, do you sort of agree on that?
Yeah, I do. And my, again, tongue-in-cheek reply to what Murray can do to make his season the best possible is not get dragged into too many 5-setters in the first 2 rounds of slams that he can't walk around in the 3rd round. Berrettini's a reasonable 5-setter, but he's still slow to get out the traps again. He's capable of winning these matches quicker. There's no reason he should be getting dragged into 5 with Kokkinakis. He proved he can kind of hobble around and claw 3 sets away from him later on. Why not do it earlier? Simple as that, obviously.
In fairness, Kokkinakis played out of his skin for the first 2 sets. It wasn't. That wasn't.
Murray let him play.
Let him play. Well,
I'm joking.
He just did. I've criticised him for these instances before, but I think the Berrettini and the Kokkinakis match would be extremely harsh. They weren't his fault. He was
it's
down.
A pattern, Calvin. It's a pattern. We need to.
Calvin, do you think
Do
you think, without letting George bait you too much, do you think he is getting the hang of playing more aggressive and shortening points and leaning on the forehand?
Not really. No, I haven't seen. I didn't see. I mean, look, at the end of the match against Kokkinakis, he certainly did, and he ended up winning. But it's just his nature. It's the scorpion and the frog again. He's still, when you've spent your entire life from the age of 6 until 35, winning matches by making balls, frustrating opponents, going by the credo that the last person that puts a ball in the court always wins every single tennis point. I just don't see him changing at this stage.
I think the other question I'd ask to this question is what are we considering success for Murray these days? I mean, for me, if he can get back in the top 30, that would be a successful season.
Semi-finals of Wimbledon. That's that for me. Like, I don't think he's gonna. If he makes semi-finals of Wimbledon and loses in straight sets, I think he might go. Yeah, fair enough.
He could have made the semis of this.
Yes, I know. But complete. I literally said it. I said if he beats Bautista Agut, he makes the semis, no question. But I think success is semis of Wimbledon. He won't be happy with quarters.
And then again, if you're calling that his success, then you have to play the clay. You have to get seeded. You have to give yourself the best chance possible to have 2 straight set first 2 rounds, and then he's capable of beating anyone on grass still. Maybe not.
I didn't get the feeling when he lost and when he left the grounds and when in his interviews after his press conference, I didn't get the impression that he thought this was his last Australian Open. Did you guys?
No, not at all. Like he's
in quite a good place.
Yeah, he thinks he's really good now. I mean, he is really good, obviously, but like he he's been more bullish about his tennis than ever before, and he was just. I think he sort of thought the same as we do, that he just shouldn't have got dragged into 2 5-setters, and that he proved by beating Berrettini that he's good enough to beat players at that level, and he did play brilliantly that day. But his serve speeds dropped 20 miles an hour over the week, which tells you a lot about what happened to his back, which actually is what Bob Bryan said. Bob Bryan said lower back's the biggest problem with the hip, because you've all of a sudden got a lopsided body and like one hip that does one thing and another hip does another thing. So, right, let's move on because there's loads to get through. One word answers on this one, please. Kenny Koala says, which of the quarterfinalists on the women's and men's draw is your most surprising? George, do you want to go first?
I was surprised to see Magda Linette get to the quarterfinals.
Seems quite reasonable.
And Liri Lehechka. I think you
Lehechka.
can tell how Lehechka. Excuse me. I think you can tell how unlikely it is for a player to do this by looking at our fantasy picks, and one person in about 200 picks him. So I always use that as a pretty good indicator. And I was surprised it was one. That's how I know it's a surprise.
Yeah. Calvin, who's your biggest surprise in the men's quarterfinals and the women's?
Oh, it's Lehechka in the men's, without doubt, isn't it? The women's, is there ever a surprise? In any of them, like...
I am surprised Karolina Pliskova has made it on the basis that I named my fantasy team after her.
So I was going to pick Karolina Pliskova as my surprise because she's actually winning. That is a real surprise. Everyone else...
There's 2 of the top 24 seeds. 2 of the top 22 seeds have made the quarters.
I mean, the men's isn't much better, to be fair. Elena Rybakina is literally the 22nd seed.
No, it's 4.
What? Well, no, there's 2 top 20 seeds, aren't there?
Pegula, Sabalenka, Ostapenko, Rybakina's.
Ostapenko's 17, that's right. Yeah. Arguably, the women's semi-finals, the quarterfinals are stronger than the men's.
I think they're quite good quarterfinals in the women's. I've been quite impressed. Obviously, we lost Swiatek, but the top half, particularly Rybakina, Ostapenko, Pegula, Azarenka, that's not a bad lineup.
You're making a bed for yourself there, George, because those matches will have been played by the time people listen to this, and quite possibly absolute duds. Who knows? Especially because Rybakina and Ostapenko is first on, and they both really struggled with the sun on Rod Laver the other day. But anyway, we have to move on, George. I can't let you talk. John Williamson says, given the disruption of the quarterfinal draw at the Australian Open, will any female tennis player win more than one Grand Slam during 2023 or 2024? Usually we default to Naomi Osaka here, but presumably we think Iga Świątek's going to win more than one.
Is he asking one across the 2 seasons or more than one per season? Świątek will win 3 minimum across the next 2 years, I think.
Yeah, Świątek will win 2 this year.
Well, that seems like a good place to move on to the women's draw then, because the first name I have written down is Iga Świątek. She was a shock exit in the 4th round. She lost to Elena Rybakina in straight sets. It's a pretty interesting match, actually, in lots of ways. She was given a time violation before it even started, because you're allowed 60 seconds between warm-up and the match starting, and she was still sat on a bench at 65 seconds. I asked her about it afterwards, actually, and she said that she didn't really hear the umpire, and it's very loud out there, and it was a bit weak, to be honest. But I think it definitely discombobulated her. She had 40-15 in both the first 2 games and lost them both. She struggled with the sun early in the day as well. A few players have struggled with this. Dan Evans was talking about it a lot, that if you're first on or second on after a doubles match, the sun's really awkward. I don't know why it's particularly here, rather than, Wimbledon the sun doesn't shine, which helps. But yes, she struggled with the ball toss. She also struggled with the fact that Elena Rybakina was banging them down at 122 miles an hour and hitting her forehanding. Well, actually, Mark Petchey made a good point on commentary that the backhand is the better shot, certainly the more consistent. George, how surprised are you? I know it's WTA and we always say no surprises, but as a result, it's a surprise.
Look, I thought Świątek would win the tournament, but in terms of the type of player who's capable of beating Świątek, Rybakina's definitely one of them. She's a fantastic player. She hits the ball brilliantly. She's got a big serve. She gets a lot of free points, which a lot of women's players don't get that many free points off their serve like she can. And she hits it really nicely off both wings. The biggest frustration with Rybakina is, she's won Wimbledon last year, been utterly dreadful for the following 6 months. But she's capable of doing this. And there's no reason why, in terms of everything she's got as a recipe for a player, she should be top 5 in the world. And I know she didn't get her Wimbledon ranking points, and that is obviously a big barrier to her being that high. But her form was so poor in between. So I actually think this is quite a good result if she can kick on and maintain that form, because she is someone who can create that rivalry with Swiatek. She's young. She's got everything in there, only 23. So, yeah, I think it's not necessarily a terrible result, but she'll probably go on and lose to Ostapenko, and I've said that.
I think as well, we talked, Calvin, off-air about the lack of variety in the women's game, and actually Swiatek and Rybakina are quite different players, and I think, as George says, if you had those two playing each other 4 or 5 times in big events, in big matches, and yeah, Rybakina should be seeded like 9 or something, so it wouldn't be a 4th rounder, then it probably would be quite watchable, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a match that I'd like to see more of, and I think we will see a lot more of that later on in some of the slams coming up. And I think most importantly as well that you can see Rybakina thinks that she can beat Swiatek. There was no lack of belief or panic that I've seen in a lot of players over the last year, that they're just not convinced that they can beat her, whereas she looks like that's no concerns at all. Yeah,
and I think getting to know her a bit more, Wimbledon was pretty fraught. She got bombarded with a lot of Russia questions because, to all intents and purposes, she is Russian. Like, I don't really want to beat around the bush about this. Her parents live in Moscow. She grew up in Moscow. The Kazakh Federation have a lot of money, and she wasn't getting much support from the Russian Federation because there are lots of players, and they offered her a way out. And, fair play. Britain did it. Britain did it to Novak Djokovic. Britain did it to Cam Norrie. Britain did it to Aliash Bednay. With varying degrees of success, and obviously Djokovic didn't even take it. So it is a thing that happens, and what I'm saying is she got asked a lot of questions about being Russian because she's Russian. And so it meant that we didn't get much of a chance to see her personality, and she is quite introverted, like Swiatek, and it's taken us a while to get to know Swiatek. And I feel like Rybakina, I interviewed her in interview room 3, which, for people who know these events, there's the main interview room, then there's room 2, and then there's places you put the doubles players, with the greatest respect. And I interviewed her along with one other person in room 3 after the second round, and just felt like getting to know her a little bit more and, understanding her personality. And she is quite bullish, and I asked her about playing on outside courts because she's complained about that before, and she said, I don't care. As long as I keep winning, I'll get on the big courts eventually. And she did eventually, of course, get onto Rod Laver, which is the second time she's played there. She played Barty in the 3rd round a few years ago, and then she played Swiatek, so it's quite the baptism, I would suggest. It wasn't the only shock result. In fact, just half an hour later, Iga Swiatek left and was followed out the tournament by Coco Gauff, who lost in straight sets to Jelena Ostapenko. It was, again, an intriguing matchup because I think they are quite different players. Gauff is a brilliant athlete, and I know there's a cliche about calling black sports people brilliant athletes, but Coco Gauff is the best getter in the game. I'm absolutely sure of that. She also has probably the best backhand in the game, but as was kind of demonstrated, she doesn't have the best forehand, and her second serve is exploitable, George, and it's kind of the same problems for Coco Gauff, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and against lesser opponents, what she had probably would have been enough, but I think Ostapenko might be one of the most kind of underratedly fun people to kind of keep your eyes on in tennis, or in any sport, actually. She's just off her head. I mean, she's great fun. She really just kind of does whatever she likes. She'll either be absolutely dreadful or absolutely brilliant, but when she's hot, she's absolutely fantastic. She's a really good watch. I think she hit more than 30 winners or something, kind of blasted her past Gauff. As you said, Gauff, a brilliant kind of getter. So yeah, Ostapenko's another one who just hasn't kicked on since winning that first slam. She won it really young. she's more than capable. She's still young enough. 25. There's
I know
plenty
this
of
is
time
the
for her in
thing,
her
right?
career.
You say Elena Ostapenko, and you're like, oh god, veteran. And yeah, she's 25. Like, my only slight concern, and I say this kind of advisedly, is she's not in great shape physically, and I would question, like, as the tournament goes on, she's also still in the doubles, I think, she's still in the mixed, I should say, with Dega Hernandez, I think, and I would just question whether she's gonna have all of her physicality, because she doesn't play a super physical game, but it's hot and it's Australia, and okay, Rybakina's not going to make it physical, but if she gets through and plays Jessica Pegula, for example, then she certainly will make it physical, and similarly Victoria Azarenka, who's the other option. I interviewed Ostapenko at Eastbourne this year, and it was great fun. And she does say what she thinks, and she's quite quirky, and she's also very caring and very passionate and quite thoughtful. She said she was incredibly naughty at school, which didn't surprise me at all. And yeah, I think, as you say, George, I think she is an underrated character. On the other side of the net, Coco Gauff is someone whose character everyone rates, and everyone thinks she's a great person. She came in and did press, and she actually broke down in tears during one of her answers. And it's always distressing to see an athlete in distress, but you want to see how much it matters. Like, it's important to know that they care.
Yeah, and look, Goff is obviously really good for tennis and one of these kind of potentially great ambassadorial figures for tennis that we've kind of had over the last few years, with guys like Federer, Serena. She can fill that void, but you do need both types of these players really as a sport. And Ostapenko, no one's going to be putting a poster up of her saying she's, a gloriously great sports person. She's so warm and kind, but she's real. And you don't get that often enough in professional sport. I'm not saying Goff's not real. I think Goff is a genuinely very nice, well brought up lady. But Ostapenko is just raw, and I really love that as well. So long may that continue. I don't think she's got any plans to keep filtering what she's saying, which is only good news.
Just quickly, Calvin, Coco Gauff's still in the doubles with Jessica Pegula, and she talked at length about using that frustration of losing in the singles and the doubles and kind of playing through it. I mean, you've obviously worked with players who've played singles and doubles at the same time. Is it ever a good thing to go out of the singles and still be in the doubles for your doubles game?
The singles players who are mainly singles players, when the reason that they say they don't play the big tournaments is because and don't play doubles in the big tournaments is because if they're still in the singles, they don't want to be having to play doubles, and if they're out with the singles, they don't want to be having to play doubles. Yeah, I think it's in terms of Coco Gauff. I think she genuinely sees herself as both, though. Some players have done that. McEnroe was that. Stefan Edberg won slams in both singles and doubles. And I think the Williams sisters obviously have. And I think, some players just really love playing doubles.
Mm. And I think she's definitely one of them,
yeah. And I think she sees it as a good part of development of her game. I do think she's a good thinker about the game and sees the benefits of, honing skills you get by playing doubles, more so at the net, etc. And she's a good volleyer. So, yeah, I think
she doesn't get forward enough still to use that volleying. No. She's brilliant at the net, and she doesn't find opportunities to get in enough, I think.
I think for the first time I've been convinced I'm a huge fan, as everyone who listens will know, of Coco Gauff. This was the first time, and I saw it a bit in the Raducanu match, where I'm starting to get a little bit concerned that she might not win slams. She might not win majors. She might not get to world number one. That forehand is a real problem. And I think it's not something that is just going to get better. It's not something that you think, it's just a little bit raw, but when she gets it right, it's gonna be fine. It needs some technical work, and I'm not sure that she's got the staff in that are gonna do that, if I'm honest.
I was going to say she needs to parachute in Coach Besson, the fixer of forehands, right now. Get her in.
I tell you what, I would love 6 weeks with Coco Gauff. because that forehand is resolvable. You can sort it, but the staff that she's got at the minute, I'm not sure that they are going to sort it, if I'm honest.
And sometimes it probably just needs a new voice as well. I mean, she's had the same people for quite a long time, I think I'm right in saying, and, that sometimes stagnates. Let's move on to other bits of the draw, because so far we've just talked about two women who are out. Jessica Pegula, I think we have spoken about her talents before, and we'll probably speak about her later in the week as well. Someone who's kind of gone under the radar because we've just been waiting for her to break down is Aryna Sabalenka. George, I don't think the bookies agree, but I've got her as favourite for the tournament now.
Yeah, I do as well. I really fancy it. I've fancied her kind of from the start. I've had a good feeling about her. Obviously, Swiatek was my favourite. I thought the way the draws panned out, I didn't see too many major obstacles in there, and some of those obstacles have kind of fallen. Vekic is a good quarter-final draw. Vekic has been a top 20 player. Obviously had trouble with a knee and other kind of injuries. But that she goes into that as big favourite to reach the semi-finals. She's a better version of Pliskova, I think. So she should, on paper, win that match. And I'm expecting Pliskova to beat Magda Linette, which means Pliskova is going out next round, and she will be the victim of some swearing from me if she does lose that match from a fantasy perspective, because I'm basically pitched between Pliskova versus Korda. Pliskova versus Korda for a bottle of wine, really. So I need her to keep plodding on and Korda to fall at some point. I'm not sure Hachanov's going to do the job for me. So Pegula is my second favourite, but closely followed by Rybakina. I think one of those three are the most likely to win it. And Rybakina is capable of just blasting everyone through. But I think a Pegula-Sabalenka final would be pretty tasty, to be honest, in terms of clash of styles, and two players who we've been wanting to make that next step, who've been really good at tour level and not quite done it at the slams. Be nice to kind of get those two there, because they've earned it for the rest of their tour results, I think.
Calvin, any thoughts that Aryna Sabalenka isn't going to win the Australian Open?
Yeah, I think you've always got to have thoughts, because she's proven that she tends to go a little bit at the end of slams. So I think it's far from certain. I actually think Rybakina's probably favourite.
Yeah,
she's won one before.
Yeah, which I mean can also technically be said of Ostapenko, but so long ago,
well,
and Azarenka for that matter. But both so long ago that it hardly feels that relevant. George, you were looking like you were about to say something intelligent.
It's certainly not a particularly intelligent comment, but just in recent years, having won one before in the women's game actually isn't much of a bonus to win you one. And it really true. Is normally actually less experience. So.
In fact, you'd rather not have the experience of it.
Yeah, if anything, if we're to go by women's tennis, then the favourite is Magda Linette.
Well, and who would argue against it? I'm up there for Magda Linette.
Done really well, hasn't she? To be fair, she's had a really great.
I think I'm right in saying she never got past the third round of a Grand Slam, and she's been in a lot of them.
But she's had good results before. Like she's always a bit of a tricky kind of first couple of rorounds customer. She's just got Jabeur, didn't she?
She's beaten four seeded players on her way to the quarterfinal. She's beat Alexandrova, Kontaveit, and then obviously Caroline Garcia as well, which is a very good win.
You'd have got a pretty good price on Magda Linette being the Polish player who went furthest in this tournament.
I think you've got an extremely good price indeed. On that note, I think we do have to end. Thank you very much for listening. As always, I've been James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. I've had George Bellshaw and Yorkshire's very own Calvin Betton, in case you get confused about whose voice is whose. That's always Calvin. I am technically from Yorkshire as well. People don't know that, and people don't believe it. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. Please do leave us a rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts. It's really important. It makes a massive difference to all of us. But most importantly and most enjoyably, please come back next time.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Sports Social Podcast Network.